You are standing in the quiet countryside of Buckinghamshire, England. The air smells faintly of damp earth and chalk, and the faint hum of wind moves through the hills like a sigh. It's the middle of the 18th century, a time when powdered wigs, silk stockings, and powdered faces defined high society. London is bustling with merchants, philosophers, and politicians debating the future of empire. Yet far from the grand halls of Westminster, something else stirs in the English countryside, a peculiar club whose existence feels like a rumour that refuses to die. They called it the Hellfire Club, but that was never its true name. The title was one given by gossip and scandal, whispered in coffeehouses and printed half in jest in the satirical pamphlets of the day. The members themselves preferred another term, the monks of Medmenham Abbey. They were not monks, of course, far from it, but they delighted in the irony of wearing the robes, chanting mock Latin prayers, and performing strange rituals in the ruins of a medieval abbey that had once been sacred. The Abbey Medmenham stood beside the River Thames, not far from the town of Marlow. It was a crumbling structure by the 1740s, reclaimed from centuries of neglect by a man named Sir Francis Dashwood. Dashwood was a figure of contradictions, a man of means, educated at Eton, well-travelled across Europe, and deeply fascinated by both classical art and earthly pleasures. To his friends, he was charming and witty. To his critics, he was a libertine, a blasphemer, and perhaps even a heretic. In 1746, Dashwood leased Medmenham Abbey and began to restore it, or rather, transform it. What had once been a Cistercian monastery became, under his direction, something else entirely. The motto inscribed above the entrance captured the spirit of the place. Fais que tu voudras, do what thou wilt. It was a phrase borrowed from the French writer François Rabelais, a Renaissance satirist who had used it to describe the law of a fictional utopian abbey. The motto would later be echoed by occultists and free thinkers for centuries. But here, in 18th century England, it was simply a joke among friends, a wink at morality, a rejection of restraint. Inside, the abbey was decorated with all the trappings of ancient Rome and Greece. Marble busts, painted ceilings, and carved reliefs depicting gods and nymphs adorned the walls. Yet, as night fell and candles flickered, the space took on a different tone. Cloaked men gathered around tables heavy with wine, exotic fruits, and meats brought from London. Laughter, toasts, and songs filled the hall, all beneath the watchful eyes of statues that had seen the sacred turned profane. To the uninvited, what took place inside was the stuff of scandalous legend. Stories spread that the Hellfire Club engaged in wild orgies, black masses, and mock religious ceremonies. Newspapers whispered that women of high society attended in disguise, that prayers were offered to pagan gods, and that even the devil himself was invoked in jest. But what did they really do? Historians still debate the answer. The truth, as is often the case, is both more mundane and more curious than the myth. Surviving accounts, letters, and diaries suggest that the club was less about depravity than it was about performance. A place where England's upper class could laugh at the hypocrisies of their own society. Its members included politicians, poets, and aristocrats, many of them connected through the circles of power that governed the country. There was John Wilkes, a radical journalist and future champion of liberty. There was Paul Whitehead, Dashwood's poet friend, who composed verses mocking the church and state alike. And perhaps most surprisingly, there was Benjamin Franklin, the American statesman and inventor, who visited Dashwood during his time in England. Franklin, who was never a full member but certainly a guest, seemed amused by the club's antics. In one of his letters, he described the gatherings as convivial meetings of clever men who seek the pleasures of conversation, wine, and wit. He made no mention of demons or rituals, only of laughter and debate, the sort that fills a room late into the night when candles burn low and the line between sincerity and satire blurs. And yet there was something more. Beneath Medmenham Abbey, hidden in the chalk hills, lay a network of tunnels, the Hellfire Caves. They were man-made, carved into the earth under Dashwood's supervision, stretching nearly a quarter of a mile underground. By day, they were a marvel of architecture and geology. By night, they became a stage for the club's secretive gatherings. The air in the caves was damp, heavy with the scent of limestone and oil lamps. The passageways twisted and turned, leading from chamber to chamber, each named after ancient places of myth. The river Styx, the temple of Venus, the inner temple. Visitors described walls decorated with strange carvings and alcoves for drinking and feasting. One chamber, known as the banqueting hall, was large enough to host dozens. To walk those tunnels, even today, is to feel something uneasy, not fear, exactly, but a weight of history pressing close. Imagine the laughter of men echoing through those dark corridors, the clink of glasses, the low murmur of philosophical debate, and the occasional cry of merriment that breaks into the silence of the earth. For all their revelry, the members of the Hellfire Club were not outcasts. Many of them held high positions in government. Dashwood himself would later become Chancellor of the Exchequer, the man responsible for Britain's finances. The idea that such a man once donned a monk's robe and toasted to Bacchus in an underground temple delighted his enemies and horrified his allies. But the 18th century was an age of contradictions. It was an era of enlightenment, when reason and science challenged the old order. Yet it was also a time when superstition lingered, when secret societies flourished in the shadow of the church. Freemasons, Rosicrucians, and other clubs proliferated across Europe, each claiming some ancient mystery or moral purpose. The Hellfire Club, in its way, was both parody and participant in this trend, a reflection of a society trying to reconcile faith and reason, restraint and desire. The details of their membership were deliberately obscure. There were no official lists, no minutes of meetings, no surviving constitution. Everything we know is pieced together from letters, gossip, and fragments of memory. Even the dates are uncertain. Some claim the club began in the 1740s and ended in the 1760s. Others suggest it was never a formal organization at all, but a series of loose gatherings that faded naturally as its members grew older and politics took precedence over pleasure. Yet the stories persisted. That rituals were held under moonlight, that statues of classical gods were used in mock worship, that women of society joined them disguised as nuns. Perhaps they did. Or perhaps that was the public's way of making sense of something that defied categorization. A space where the powerful mocked themselves, where morality was inverted not for sin, but for satire. Still, one cannot help but imagine the flicker of candlelight upon stone walls, the low hum of voices reciting a parody of Mass, the smell of wine and wax mingling in the air. Beneath it all, there is a sense of something deeply human, the yearning for freedom, for laughter in the face of hypocrisy, for escape from the rigid codes of a polite but suffocating world. As years passed, the rumors became legend. Some said Dashwood's caves hid treasures or occult secrets. Others believed that dark pacts were made there. When Dashwood died in 1781, the caves were sealed for a time, and the abbey fell silent once more. The club was gone, but its myth lived on, a symbol of aristocratic excess and Enlightenment irony. The motto still lingers over the abbey's gate, weathered by centuries of rain, "Do what thou wilt." A simple phrase, yet it invites a question that still echoes softly through history. Did they truly mean it? Or was it all, in the end, a joke? One last toast to the follies of mankind, buried beneath the chalk hills of England. When you think of the English upper class of the 18th century, you might imagine powdered wigs, quiet drawing rooms, and long debates about trade or colonial taxes. You probably don't imagine those same men descending into candlelit caves beneath the English countryside, wearing monks' robes, and raising toasts to ancient gods of wine. Yet that is precisely what some of the most powerful men in Britain were doing. By the mid-1750s, the Hellfire Club, under Sir Francis Dashwood's stewardship, had become more than a rumour. It was a sanctuary for men of politics, intellect, and mischief, those who ruled the country by day and mocked its morals by night. And among their number were figures whose names shaped the British Empire's direction, men who would sit in Parliament, govern colonies, and pass the laws of an age that called itself enlightened. Dashwood himself was a paradox. He had travelled through Europe in his youth, visiting the ruins of Rome, the palaces of Venice, and the temples of Greece. He was fluent in Latin and Italian, well-read in philosophy, and admired for his wit. But he was also notorious for his pranks. In one infamous incident during his travels, Dashwood disguised himself as a Franciscan friar to gain access to a convent in Italy, a jest that scandalized even his friends. His humor was irreverent, his charm undeniable, and his appetite for mockery endless. When he returned to England, he found society itself ripe for satire. London's elite, for all their refinement, were entangled in hypocrisy. Politicians preached virtue while accepting bribes. Clergymen warned of sin while enjoying the luxuries of patronage. Dashwood saw in this a kind of theatre, a grand hypocrisy waiting to be laughed at. The Hellfire Club became his stage. The membership of the club read like a who's who of mid-18th century power. There was John Montagu, the 4th Earl of Sandwich, whose name would later be immortalised in the lunchtime staple. Montagu was both a gambler and a statesman, serving as First Lord of the Admiralty. He was sharp-tongued, brilliant, and frequently at odds with public opinion. There was Paul Whitehead, poet and satirist, who acted as the club's unofficial chronicler, composing verses that both celebrated and mocked their escapades. And there was John Wilkes, a man whose story deserves its own volume. Wilkes was a journalist, politician, and provocateur, a man with a talent for both words and scandal. He was a friend of Dashwood's and a frequent visitor to Medmenham. Together, they shared not only their love of wine and wit, but also their disdain for the rigid piety of the age. It was Wilkes, more than anyone, who would bring the shadow of the Hellfire Club into the public light. At first, the club's activities were private amusements. They met a few times a year, often around religious festivals, particularly Walpurgis Night and St. John's Eve, dates associated with old folk traditions and, in the public imagination, witchcraft. The irony was intentional. Members would dress as monks, chant mock prayers, and raise their glasses to Bacchus or Venus, celebrating what they called the virtues of pleasure. There were women, too, though how many and who they were remains uncertain. Some accounts suggest actresses and courtesans from London's theatre world were invited to the gatherings. Others claim that women of noble birth attended in secret, veiled or masked, enjoying the freedom that society otherwise denied them. No lists were kept, no names recorded. The secrecy was absolute. What happened in the cave stayed there. Outside, the country hummed with gossip. The Hellfire Club was said to be the meeting place of blasphemers and atheists, a den of sin where the aristocracy mocked the church. Pamphleteers in London printed lurid tales of devil worship, of black masses and sacrifices. None of these were proven, of course, but the mere idea that England's ruling class might secretly ridicule the very institutions they claimed to defend was scandal enough, and perhaps that was the point. For beneath the jokes and the rituals there was a deeper message. The Enlightenment was transforming Europe. Old certainties about God, government, and the natural order were being questioned. Philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau were challenging monarchies and church authority. In England, coffee houses buzzed with debates about liberty and reason. The Hellfire Club, in its irreverent way, was part of that same spirit of rebellion, mocking not faith itself, but the hypocrisy of those who used it as a shield for power. It was also, paradoxically, a world of exclusivity. Only the elite could afford to sneer at the rules. The club's motto, Facque tu voudras, do what thou wilt, was not a democratic slogan. It was a declaration of privilege. It said, in essence, we are the few who are free enough to laugh at the law. For the rest, obedience was expected. Yet even among the powerful, that freedom had limits. The turning point came, as such things often do, through scandal. In 1763, John Wilkes published the first issue of his magazine, The North Briton. It was a satirical journal that attacked government corruption and mocked the monarchy's ministers. Wilkes's wit was sharp, his politics incendiary. He soon found himself at odds with the establishment. But it was not the North Briton that caused the downfall of the Hellfire Club. It was a far less serious piece of writing, one that began as an inside joke. Some years earlier, Wilkes and Dashwood had collaborated on a mock poem titled An Essay on Woman. It was a parody of Alexander Pope's famous essay on man, laced with lewd humour and blasphemy. Meant to be read aloud among friends in the caves of Medmenham, it was never intended for public eyes. But when Wilkes's enemies in Parliament obtained a copy, they seized upon it as evidence of moral depravity. The poem was denounced in the House of Lords. Dashwood, now a member of the government, was humiliated. The press had a field day. The once secret meetings of the Hellfire Club became the stuff of public outrage. Suddenly, the playful mockery that had been their private amusement was reinterpreted as an act of treasonous blasphemy. Dashwood tried to downplay the rumours. He insisted that the club had been nothing more than a few friends drinking together in harmless mirth. But the damage was done. By the mid-1760s, the club had dissolved, its members scattered, its name forever tainted by scandal. The caves were sealed. The abbey fell quiet again. Yet, as often happens with secrecy, the silence only made the story grow louder. Writers began to embellish the legend. In the decades that followed, the Hellfire Club became a symbol of hidden corruption. Novelists and moralists alike portrayed it as a den of vice, a place where the rich mocked God, the devil walked among men, and England's leaders sold their souls in laughter. Even Benjamin Franklin's visits to Medmenham were reimagined by later generations as proof of his supposed dabbling in occult matters. In truth, Franklin's letters speak only of dinner and conversation, but the myth proved irresistible. The club had become something larger than itself, a mirror held up to society's contradictions. Beneath the surface of England's order and piety lay a truth that everyone sensed: but few dared to say aloud that those in power were often driven by the same human follies as anyone else. The difference was that they could afford to hide them better, and perhaps that was why the Hellfire Club endured in memory. Not because of what its members actually did, but because of what they represented, the tension between public virtue and private indulgence, between the light of reason and the shadows it casts. Even today, the phrase Hellfire Club evokes mystery. It has been borrowed by novelists, television writers, and conspiracy theorists. Yet the real story, when stripped of exaggeration, is one of satire rather than sin, laughter rather than evil. Still, one can imagine the candlelight glinting off the cave walls, the echo of laughter deep underground, and the faint, mocking chant of mock monks toasting to Bacchus and liberty. It all ended, as these things do, with politics and scandal. But as the 18th century moved toward revolution and reform, one can't help wondering, did the laughter of those nights beneath the earth echo, in some quiet way, into the age of revolutions that followed? When the laughter faded, and the torches went out beneath the hills of West Wycombe, the world above had already begun to change. The 18th century that had tolerated Dashwood's jokes and Wilkes's provocations was giving way to something less forgiving. Britain was at war, not merely abroad, but with itself, in the endless contest between liberty and order, religion and reason. The days when gentlemen could mock sacred things in private caves were slipping away, replaced by an age of public opinion, journalism and revolution. By the time Sir Francis Dashwood died in 1781, the Hellfire Club had already become a memory half whispered, half myth. The abbey stood silent again, its stones softened by ivy, its motto still carved above the entrance face, Que te vaudras, do what thou wilt. The caves, sealed and forgotten for nearly a century, slept beneath the chalk hills, their walls still bearing traces of soot and laughter. But history has a peculiar way of remembering the things it was meant to forget. After Dashwood's death, the Medmenham estate passed to his half-brother and later to his heirs. The caves, those long echoing tunnels of chalk and damp earth, were rediscovered in the early 19th century, when curious travellers began to write about them once again. By then, the Enlightenment had become history, and the Gothic imagination of the Romantic period had taken hold. To poets and dreamers, the idea of a secret society of libertines beneath an ancient abbey was irresistible. They imagined candlelit orgies, infernal rites, and blasphemous laughter echoing in the darkness. Artists painted scenes of masked revelers raising goblets to Satan. Novelists filled their pages with corrupted priests and decadent nobles who made pacts in underground temples. None of it was true, but it didn't matter. It felt true, because it spoke to something in the human imagination, the fear that behind every mask of civility lies something wild and untamed. In reality, the Hellfire Club had never been a satanic cult. Its irreverence was intellectual, its blasphemy theatrical. Dashwood and his friends were men of their time, heirs to a world that prized wit and skepticism. They mocked religion not because they believed in evil, but because they were tired of pretense. Yet, like all satire, theirs was double-edged. The joke was meant for themselves, but the echoes carried further than they intended. Once the public heard the whispers of their mock rituals, the image of English gentlemen in monks' robes became a symbol of hypocrisy. To the rising middle class, the Hellfire Club embodied everything wrong with aristocracy. Its decadence, its secrecy, its sense of impunity. And so, in the quiet years that followed, the laughter turned to legend, and legend turned to warning. By the early 1800s, England's world had shifted. The Industrial Revolution was remaking society. Napoleon's armies had marched across Europe. Revolutions had shaken old monarchies. The ideals of liberty and equality, once discussed in jest over wine at Medmenham, had now become the rallying cries of nations. It is tempting to wonder whether Dashwood, had he lived to see it, would have recognized the irony. His motto, "Do what thou wilt," had been a joke among gentlemen who believed themselves untouchable. But in the century that followed, those words took on a different power. They became a whisper of rebellion, of freedom, of individual will against the constraints of authority. In this way, the Hellfire Club's spirit, detached from its decadent trappings, found a strange afterlife. It appeared in new forms, in secret societies, in Masonic lodges, in the coffee houses where radicals met to discuss reform. The notion that men might gather in private to question the old order, to laugh at its idols, to invent a new kind of morality, that idea survived long after the candles at Medmenham went dark. But history, as always, had other plans for the men themselves. John Wilkes, the firebrand who had turned satire into politics, became a folk hero. His arrest for seditious libel in 1763 sparked riots in London, and his defiance of Parliament helped define the modern idea of freedom of the press. Crowds shouted Wilkes and liberty in the streets. The same man who once toasted to Bacchus in the Hellfire caves had become a symbol of democracy. It is difficult to imagine a stranger transformation. Paul Whitehead, Dashwood's poet and companion, died in 1774. In his will, he asked that his heart be placed in an urn and kept at West Wycombe, where Dashwood had built a great mausoleum on the hill above the caves. For years afterward, visitors claimed that Dashwood would lead them up the hill to show them Whitehead's urn. His voice tinged with melancholy. "There lies the heart of a man who loved his friends and mocked his times," he is said to have murmured. Whether that story is true hardly matters, it feels appropriate. Lord Sandwich, the other great name among the monks of Medmenham, survived his contemporaries but not his reputation. He remained in government, becoming a key figure in the administration that faced the American Revolution. He was vilified by the press as corrupt, lazy, and immoral. It was in that climate that the story of his association with the Hellfire Club resurfaced, a ghost of his youth used to condemn his politics. And Sir Francis Dashwood, the man who began it all, became in the end a figure of quiet paradox. Despite his reputation for excess, he devoted much of his later life to public works, building roads, improving agriculture, and supporting the arts. The same man accused of blasphemy and sin was, by his death, remembered as a generous benefactor to his county. Perhaps he, too, understood that the laughter had to end somewhere. The caves remained closed for decades after his passing. They were reopened briefly in the 19th century, then again in the 20th, when local historians began to map them. Today, you can visit them, the Hellfire Caves of West Wycombe, preserved as a curious monument to eccentricity. Tourists walk through tunnels once filled with laughter and candle smoke. The chambers still bear the names the club gave them: the banqueting hall, the river Styx, the inner temple. If you listen carefully, you might even imagine the echo of voices, not ghostly, but historical, the residue of men who believed that wit was the highest virtue, and that laughter, even at the expense of the sacred, was a kind of freedom. Visitors often ask, were they truly evil? Did they worship the devil? The guides usually smile and shake their heads. No evidence, they say, only stories. And yet, when you step into the inner temple, where the last chamber opens beneath the hill, there is a peculiar stillness. The air is cool, heavy with centuries of breath. The candles flicker against the chalk walls, and the sound of your footsteps seems to fall into infinity. In that darkness, it is easy to imagine what those 18th century men must have felt. A mixture of fear, wonder, and exhilaration at having created a world of their own, apart from the one above ground. Perhaps that, more than anything else, was the true meaning of the Hellfire Club. Not blasphemy, not sin, but escape. From the strictures of class, of religion, of expectation. Beneath the earth they could be free, if only for an evening. The world moved on without them. Empires rose and fell. The Enlightenment gave way to industry, and industry to modernity. But the story of the Hellfire Club endured. Sometimes as a warning, sometimes as a joke, sometimes as a symbol of the eternal dance between freedom and folly. Even the motto survived. In the early 20th century, it was revived by the occultist Aleister Crowley, who made it central to his philosophy of thelema. For Crowley, "Do what thou wilt" became a creed of spiritual freedom, though he likely borrowed it from Rabelais, not Dashwood. Still, the echo is unmistakable. The words that once hung above a Georgian abbey in jest have become a thread running through centuries of thought about liberty and desire. One might say that Dashwood's joke, unintended as it was, became one of history's most persistent ideas. If you were to visit West Wycombe today, you would find a village little changed by time. The abbey still stands, its Georgian facade elegant and slightly melancholy. The mausoleum crowns the hill, its great stone arches open to the sky. Below, the caves stretch quietly into the earth, lit now by electric lamps instead of flickering candles. Tourists come and go, some amused, others slightly uneasy. Children giggle at the idea of monks of mischief. Adults read the plaques and wonder whether the stories are true. And somewhere in that air, in the stillness of those tunnels, there remains the faint sense of something that cannot quite be defined. Not sin, not sanctity, something between. The memory of a time when men who ruled an empire sought meaning, or perhaps only amusement, in parody and wine. When the line between faith and farce blurred, and laughter became a kind of protest. The Hellfire Club was born in an age of contradictions, and it died in one. An age that celebrated reason yet feared what reason revealed. It was, in the end, A mirror of the world it mocked, brilliant, hypercritical, foolish, and endlessly human. And so, the story ends where it began, beneath the hills of Buckinghamshire, in the cold air of the caves, where laughter once echoed against the stone. You can almost hear it still, the murmur of voices, the clink of glasses, the whisper of the motto carried through time, "Do what thou wilt." A phrase meant as a jest, now an idea that refuses to fade, and one is left to wonder, as all ages must when confronting their own follies. Were they mocking the world, or were they merely mocking themselves? You are in the Dutch Republic, sometime around the 1630s. The air is damp and clean, laced with the salt of the North Sea, and the faint perfume of flowers drifting from cultivated gardens. Amsterdam is a city of canals and calm precision, narrow houses leaning slightly toward one another, tall windows reflecting light onto rippling water. Ships from the East Indies fill the harbour, their hulls heavy with spices, porcelain, and silks. This is the height of the Dutch Golden Age, a time when merchants rule, painters capture the light of everyday life, and trade seems to have made the Netherlands the richest patch of earth on the planet. Money, like the sea, ebbs and flows through every street, every canal, every counting house, and amid it all, among ledgers and spices and the hum of commerce, something unusual begins to bloom. A flower, a tulip, not a practical crop, not a useful commodity, just a flower. Beautiful, delicate, and absurdly expensive. Tulips were not native to Europe. They had come from the Ottoman Empire, brought by merchants and botanists in the late 16th century. In the gardens of Constantinople, the tulip was already a symbol of refinement and luxury. To the Dutch, it was exotic, rare, and irresistibly elegant. Its petals, shaped like flames, seemed to defy the pale restraint of northern gardens. The first tulips to arrive in the Netherlands were gifts, curiosities for scholars and collectors. One of the earliest known admirers was Carolus Clusius, a botanist who planted them in the gardens of Leiden University in 1593. He guarded them carefully, recording their colours and varieties. Yet, as legend has it, some of his bulbs were stolen in the night. Those stolen bulbs became the ancestors of countless tulip fields across the country. By the early 17th century, tulips were no longer just plants. They were a form of status, a living emblem of taste and wealth. The more unusual the flower, the higher its value. Some tulips displayed vivid stripes or flames of contrasting colour, the result of a virus unknowingly carried by the plant. The Dutch called them broken tulips, and they became the most prized of all. Imagine for a moment the scene: a small clay pot on a merchant's windowsill, a single tulip rising from dark soil. The petals flare red and white like fire captured in silk. In that quiet house, the flower becomes more than a bloom. It becomes a statement. That flower says, "I am prosperous." It says, "I can afford beauty." At first, the trade in tulips was modest, a pastime for scholars, gardeners, and the wealthy elite. But as the Republic's prosperity grew, so too did its appetite for rare things. Paintings, porcelain, spices, and now flowers. Tulip bulbs began to circulate not only among botanists but among merchants and speculators. They were bought and sold through informal networks. Agreements scribbled on paper, sealed with a handshake or a glass of wine. And as with all things desirable, the price began to rise. In Amsterdam, Haarlem, and other trading towns, tulip auctions became fashionable events. A bulb of a rare variety might sell for several times a skilled craftsman's annual wage. The most coveted of all was the Semper Augustus, a tulip streaked with white and crimson, whose price climbed higher with every passing month. One recorded sale from 1636 valued a single bulb at more than 5,000 guilders, enough to buy a fine house on a canal, complete with servants, furniture, and stables. People began to murmur about tulips as an investment, something that could make a fortune overnight. A merchant might sell his shares in a spice venture to buy a bulb. A weaver might pawn his tools to secure a piece of paper promising future delivery of one. By 1635, the tulip trade had taken on a life of its own. Contracts were exchanged, speculation ran wild, and new varieties were bred and named with pride. Some bore poetic titles: Admiral van Enkhuizen, General of Gouda, Viceroy non plus ultra. Each name added a touch of grandeur, as though the flower were not a plant at all but a nobleman. And then came the wind handle, the wind trade. The wind trade was a curious invention of the Dutch market, because tulip bulbs could only be dug up and traded during certain months, from June to September. Most buying and selling occurred in the winter, when the bulbs were still underground. So instead of trading the bulbs themselves, people began to trade promises, contracts agreeing to buy or sell bulbs at a later date, once they could be lifted from the earth. These were the world's first futures contracts, though no one called them that at the time. and with them came a new kind of wealth. Not tangible, not physical, but made entirely of paper, trust, and expectation. Prices soared. In taverns and guildhalls, men gathered not to drink ale, but to exchange tulip contracts. Records from Haarlem mention one man who traded away a single bulb for 12 acres of land. Another promised a ton of butter, 1,000 pounds of cheese, and a silver cup in exchange for a viceroy. It all seemed harmless enough, a game of chance played by people who had grown rich on trade. The Dutch Republic was at its zenith. Even a servant might dabble in tulips. Why not? Money flowed freely, and everyone believed the flower market could only rise. The tulip had become more than a plant. It had become a dream of easy wealth, a symbol of beauty that could be bought and sold like any other commodity. And yet, beneath the laughter and speculation, there was something uneasy. Some saw the absurdity clearly. In pamphlets and broadsheets, moralists mocked the flower madness that had seized the Republic. One anonymous author wrote, "The tulip, mongers are merchants of wind. They trade not in bulbs, but in promises. They plant gold in the earth and reap folly in the spring." Still, the market grew. It seemed unstoppable, until it wasn't. In the winter of 1636-1637, tulip contracts reached their highest prices. Auctions in Haarlem and Alkmaar were crowded, the air thick with excitement. People spoke of bulbs as if they were coins, as if beauty itself could be turned into profit. But then, quite suddenly, something shifted. No one knows exactly why. Perhaps it was a failed sale, a rumor of fraud, or simply the realization that the prices had grown absurd. In February 1637, a routine auction in Haarlem went quiet. The buyers hesitated, the bids faltered, and for the first time in months, a seller found no takers. The silence spread like frost. Within days, the prices collapsed. Contracts that had been worth thousands of guilders became worthless scraps of paper. Fortunes vanished overnight. Merchants who had boasted of their floral wealth found themselves ruined. It was said that a man who had traded his brewery for tulip bulbs could not even sell them for the price of a loaf of bread. But in those first stunned days, amid the wreckage of the trade, few could comprehend what had happened. The tulip itself remained as beautiful as ever, its petals still red and gold, its bloom unchanged. What had changed was belief. The flower had been a mirror, reflecting the desires of an age drunk on its own prosperity. When that mirror cracked, the Dutch found themselves staring not at the tulip, but at their own reflection, their greed, their faith in paper, their hunger for beauty and status. Pamphlets flooded the streets once again. Sermons thundered about divine punishment for vanity. Painters captured the folly in allegories. Monkeys dressed as merchants buying and selling flowers, counting coins, and weeping when the market fell. The tulip, once a symbol of refinement, had become a lesson. And yet the story was not over. Because, as with all things in history, the truth was more complicated than the legend that would follow. Did the crash really ruin the Dutch Republic? Were thousands truly bankrupted by bulbs? Or was it, as some later historians suggest, a smaller storm, exaggerated by moralists and mythmakers into a parable for the ages? The real story, like the tulip itself, was more subtle. As the spring of 1637 arrived, the tulips bloomed once more, indifferent to the fortunes lost in their name. Their colours brightened the gardens of Haarlem and Leyden, their petals opening with quiet grace. They had no knowledge of markets, no care for contracts. They were as they had always been, flowers, delicate, transient, beautiful. But for the people of the Dutch Republic, the bloom now carried a different meaning. It was a reminder that wealth could vanish as quickly as petals fall from the stem. Still, the story of tulip mania would grow in the telling, passed down through centuries as a warning, retold by economists and writers alike. It would become a symbol of every speculative bubble that followed. The railway booms, the stock manias, the digital frenzies. Each time, the tulip would return, quietly blooming in the background of human ambition. And so we are left with a question that echoes softly across time, as gentle as a breeze across a Dutch canal. Did the tulip bring ruin to Holland, or did it merely show Holland to itself? The winter of 1637 was colder than usual in the Dutch Republic. The canals froze early that year, turning waterways into gleaming ribbons of ice where skaters glided in slow circles under pale skies. But beneath the charm of that frozen world, the Dutch markets were beginning to thaw in ways no one could stop. In Haarlem, Alkmaar, and Amsterdam, tulip contracts that had once fetched astronomical sums began to vanish from the ledgers. Buyers who had once boasted of paying thousands of guilders for a single bulb now refused to honor their agreements. Sellers who had believed themselves rich found that no one would even answer their knocks. The crash had come quietly, but its silence was thunderous. To understand what happened next, you must remember what the tulip trade truly was, not an exchange of flowers, but an exchange of promises. During the height of the mania, most tulip bulbs were still underground, frozen in winter soil. What people had bought and sold were contracts, written agreements to deliver bulbs when spring came. But when the market collapsed, those promises evaporated like mist. The legal situation was murky. These contracts had never been sanctioned by official courts. They were informal, private agreements, often made in taverns over beer and ink. When the buyers refused to pay, the sellers discovered that they had no legal recourse. The courts of Holland, reluctant to punish so many citizens over what seemed like speculation gone wrong, quietly declared that tulip contracts were unenforceable gambling debts. And just like that, the immense paper wealth of the tulip trade vanished into nothing. In the weeks that followed, the panic spread through the Dutch Republic like an invisible frost. In Haarlem, one of the centers of the trade, meetings were held to find a solution. Merchants gathered in candlelit rooms, their ledgers open, their hands trembling. They proposed a compromise that buyers could cancel their contracts by paying a small fee, perhaps 10% of the original price. It was a desperate attempt to bring order to chaos, but even this failed to calm the markets. Few could afford even a tenth of the sums they owed, and fewer still wished to pay for bulbs that, in the cold light of day, seemed worth little more than onions. By March, the tulip trade was effectively dead. For some, the loss was catastrophic. Consider the case of Jacob van der Meer, a cloth merchant from Haarlem, who had speculated heavily on rare bulbs. In the heady months of 1636, he had sold much of his inventory to purchase a single Semper Augustus bulb, convinced that its price would rise further still. When the market collapsed, his investment became worthless. He could neither sell the bulb nor recover the goods he had traded away. Within a year, his business failed, his house was sold, and his name disappeared from the city records. Or take the story of the Van Midgeden brothers, who ran a modest brewery in Alkmaar. They had used their profits to buy tulip contracts, hoping to double their wealth. When the market crashed, they tried to pay their workers with barrels of ale, but debts overwhelmed them. The brewery closed, its doors shuttered with the frost. Yet not everyone was ruined. The wealthiest merchants, those who had entered the tulip trade as a diversion, a game, often escaped unscathed. For them, the losses were inconvenient but hardly fatal. They still owned their ships, their warehouses, their estates. In their drawing rooms, the talk of tulips soon gave way to discussions of spice prices and colonial ventures. The ones who suffered most were the artisans, the tradesmen, the hopeful middle class who had glimpsed the possibility of rising through speculation, and found themselves instead dragged back down by it. The newspapers and pamphlets of the time revelled in their misfortune. Moralists seized upon the collapse as proof of divine justice. One popular broadsheet, Flora's Malowagen, Flora's Fool's Wagon, depicted Lady Flora, the goddess of flowers, riding in a carriage drawn by monkeys. Behind her trailed a crowd of merchants, craftsmen, and weavers, their pockets turned out, their faces twisted in despair. The caption mocked them mercilessly. Thus rides the flower lord, whose bulbs are wind, whose fortunes wither when the frost begins. To the Dutch, who prized moderation and hard work, the tulip mania became a cautionary tale, a warning against greed, excess, and the seduction of easy money. Yet, for all the ridicule and ruin, the broader Dutch economy hardly noticed the tremor. The Republic continued to prosper. Trade routes expanded, ships laden with spices and silk sailed from the East Indies. Banks remained solvent, markets recovered, and life went on. Tulip mania, for all its colour and chaos, was a small chapter in the vast ledger of Dutch commerce, remarkable more for its symbolism than its actual economic impact. Historians would later debate this endlessly. Some would claim it was the first speculative bubble in history, the original warning of financial folly. Others would argue that the mania had been exaggerated by later writers, especially the moralists of the 17th century and the economists of the 19th. Indeed, when the Scottish writer Charles Mackay published his famous Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds in 1841, he painted tulip mania as a parable of human irrationality, a frenzy so wild that a single bulb might be traded for 12 acres of land. His account was vivid, moralizing, and memorable, but later research would reveal that many of these tales were embellished. The most extreme prices occurred only for the rarest bulbs, traded among a small circle of wealthy enthusiasts. The majority of transactions were modest, and the number of bankruptcies, though real, was far fewer than legend suggested. Still, the myth persisted, because it told a truth deeper than fact. It showed how quickly desire could distort value. In the quiet aftermath of the crash, tulip cultivation continued, but the flower's meaning changed. It was no longer a status symbol or a financial instrument. It returned to the gardens, to the botanists and the true lovers of flowers. The painters of the Dutch Golden Age continued to depict tulips in still lifes, often alongside skulls, hourglasses, and fading petals, symbols of impermanence and the futility of worldly wealth. One such painting, Venetas with tulips and shells, shows a single broken tulip beside a watch and a candle half burned. The message is clear: beauty fades, time passes, and fortune is fleeting. In this sense, tulip mania became part of a larger Dutch sensibility, a quiet awareness that all things, no matter how bright, eventually fade. Yet, even as the flowers returned to their rightful place in the soil, the echoes of the mania lingered in the Dutch mind. In the taverns of Haarlem, old men told the story to young apprentices as a warning: do not trade in wind. In Amsterdam, merchants joked about tulip men whenever someone speculated too eagerly on ships or shares. But perhaps the most curious consequence of the mania was not financial at all. It was cultural. The tulip, once a mere curiosity from the East, had become a permanent symbol of Dutch identity. Fields of tulips would eventually stretch across the countryside, drawing travelers from across Europe. The flower that had once caused ruin became, over centuries, the emblem of the Netherlands itself, serene, orderly, colorful. The irony was exquisite: the same bloom that had sparked madness would come to represent calm. Still, one cannot help but wonder what it must have felt like to live through those weeks of sudden reversal. To hold in your hand a bulb once worth a house, now worth nothing at all. To open your ledger and see a fortune erased. To look out at your winter garden, the ground hard and silent, knowing that the bulbs beneath the soil would soon bloom. Beautiful, yes, but useless. Perhaps that is the truest image of the tulip mania: a man standing in his garden, waiting for a flower that will no longer make him rich, but will still bloom all the same. He cannot help but feel both awe and regret. Awe for the flower's perfection, regret for what he made of it. It is a quiet, humbling kind of realization, one that would repeat across centuries in many forms. Every generation, it seems, must plant its own tulips, whether in flowers, stocks, or dreams, and then watch them bloom and fade. But there was one more twist in the tale. A small but revealing detail buried in the records of that strange winter. When the states of Holland officially declared tulip contracts unenforceable, they used a single phrase to describe them: windhandel, or the trade of wind. It was not merely poetic, it was literal. The wealth of the mania had been built on nothing tangible, on air, on expectation, on faith. And when that faith dissolved, what remained was only wind. Yet one must ask, was the tulip mania truly madness? Or was it a momentary mirror showing us the delicate balance between value and desire? Because even as we judge the traders of 1637, we must admit that the line between beauty and speculation, between admiration and greed, has never truly vanished. The thaw came slowly to the Dutch Republic in the spring of 1637. The ice melted, canals softened into mirror, like waters, and the wind shifted from bitter to mild. Across Haarlem, Alkmaar and Leyden, people ventured out to tend their gardens once again. And there, beneath the soil, the tulips waited. In those quiet days after the crash, when ledgers had been burned and reputations quietly buried, the bulbs still bloomed, as if indifferent to the ruin they had caused. In Haarlem's once prosperous trading houses, men who had been ruined stood at their windows and looked out over patches of red, white, and gold swaying gently in the spring breeze. It was said that one wealthy merchant, who had lost nearly everything, stared at his tulip beds and remarked to a friend, "They are still beautiful. Only my mind has changed." It was a simple observation, yet it captured the strange truth of the tulip mania. The flower itself had done nothing wrong. It had bloomed before men began to worship it, and it would bloom long after they had stopped. The Dutch Republic, practical and resilient, soon returned to its routines. Trade with the East Indies resumed, merchants tallied profits, and craftsmen returned to their workbenches. For all its drama, the tulip crisis had not undone the Dutch economy. In fact, to many outside observers, it seemed as though nothing much had happened at all. Ships still filled Amsterdam's harbour. The banks were stable. The price of grain and goods held steady. There were no riots, no government bailouts, no great reckoning. But in quieter ways, the mania had changed the Dutch mind. The Republic's famed sobriety, its sense of moderation, thrift, and moral restraint, deepened in the years that followed. Sermons warned against the perils of vanity. Painters filled their still lifes with fading petals and skulls. Philosophers reflected on the limits of reason in a world of temptation. The tulip, once the symbol of splendor, became the emblem of transience. For the botanists, though, life went on. Carolus Clusius had died long before the mania, but his work endured. His students continued to experiment with tulips, cataloging their colors, breeding new varieties. The strange streaks and broken patterns that had once driven prices sky high were studied, not for their beauty but for their biology. In the centuries to come, scientists would discover that the very tulips that had made fortunes were, in fact, diseased, infected by a virus carried by aphids. The infection altered the pigments in the petals, creating the flames and streaks that made collectors swoon. The most prized flowers of the 1630s had been, quite literally, beautiful because they were sick. That fact seemed to please moralists. It fit perfectly with the tale of Vanity Undone, a parable written not by men but by nature itself. Meanwhile, the memory of the mania continued to spread. By the 18th century, it had become part of Dutch folklore. Pamphlets and plays retold the story with comic exaggeration. Merchants pawning their houses for bulbs, maids buying fortunes in flowers, fools chasing petals in the wind. Outside the Netherlands, the story took on a life of its own. Foreign writers marveled that a nation as practical as the Dutch could have been consumed by such folly. In 1720, during the South Sea bubble in England, pamphleteers compared the stock speculators of London to the tulip traders of Holland. The comparison stuck. Tulip mania became the archetype. The very first financial bubble, the eternal warning that beauty and greed make poor companions. By the 19th century, when industrial capitalism was taking root, writers like Charles Mackay would resurrect the tale again, embellishing it into a moral fable about the madness of crowds. His version was colorful and enduring, a reminder that even rational people could be swept away by collective delusion. It didn't matter that later historians would question the details. The legend was too perfect to die. But in truth, the real story was subtler, and perhaps more revealing. The tulip mania was not the wild, nation-ruining frenzy later writers imagined. It was, in essence, a brief speculative bubble confined to a small circle of traders, artisans, and enthusiasts. Few were truly ruined, fewer still went mad. What made the event remarkable was not its scale, but its symbolism. For the first time in recorded history, people treated something ephemeral, a flower, a promise, a future price, as a form of currency. They had discovered the power and the peril of abstraction. They were learning that value could be imagined, and that imagination itself could create wealth. In that sense, tulip mania was not a failure of reason, but an early experiment in it. It was a moment when a young capitalist world tested the boundaries of belief. And as all experiments do, it revealed both brilliance and folly. Even centuries later, when economists studied the records of 1637, they found something strangely familiar. They saw contracts traded without underlying assets. They saw promises inflated beyond logic. They saw confidence rise, then vanish. They saw, in short, the same pattern that would repeat again and again. In railway stocks, in land booms, in dot-com startups, in digital currencies. Each generation believed its market was new, sophisticated, rational. Each generation believed it had learned from the past. And yet each time the tulip bloomed again, not in the soil, but in the human heart. If you walk through the Netherlands today, especially in the province of South Holland, you will still see tulip fields stretching to the horizon. Vast, precise, and radiant. The colors shift in bands: red, yellow, pink, violet. From above they look like woven fabric, a living tapestry. Every spring tourists arrive by the thousands to admire them. They take photographs, buy bulbs, and visit the Keukenhof Gardens, a place that might have made even the merchants of 1637 gasp. There is a strange poetry in that. The flower that once symbolized greed and folly now draws people for its serenity and beauty. The mania, long since tamed, has become a national pride. Even the Dutch, pragmatic as they are, smile at the irony. They have learned to live with their history, to plant it, literally, and watch it bloom anew each year. Yet the moral remains quietly relevant. When the first buds opened in 1637, no one believed that a simple flower could ruin fortunes. When the first contracts were signed in taverns, no one imagined they were building a world-changing myth. It was only later, when the prices fell and the laughter stopped, that they saw what they had done. Not because they were fools, but because they were human. Because to be human is to long for beauty, to chase meaning, to believe that something ephemeral can last forever. Some historians have suggested that tulip mania wasn't madness at all, that it was simply a rational market reaching the limits of rarity and taste. After all, the rarest tulips truly were unique. Their beauty could not be mass-produced. But even then, the market had a problem that still haunts us today. How do you measure the value of something that exists only in imagination? A flower once bloomed cannot be hoarded. A promise once broken cannot be repaired. The traders of 1637 learned that lesson early and harshly. One document preserved in the archives of Alkmaar records the testimony of a weaver named Hendrik, who lost his savings in tulip contracts. He was asked whether he regretted his speculation. He replied simply, "It was a fine dream while it lasted." That, perhaps, is the truest epitaph for the mania, and for all the manias that would follow, a fine dream while it lasted. As evening falls on a Dutch town in 1637, you can almost imagine it. A small house by a canal, its shutters closed against the wind. Inside, a man sits by candlelight, a tulip bulb on the table before him. He turns it over in his hands, an object of no use, no value, and yet somehow still precious. Outside, spring rain patters against the window. The markets are quiet now. The contracts have been burned, but the bulb remains silent, full of potential. Tomorrow, he will plant it again. Because even after folly, life continues. Flowers bloom, the earth renews, and hope, though it may take new forms, always returns. Centuries later, economists, historians, and dreamers would all return to that moment. The brief, improbable winter when a nation fell in love with a flower. They would argue about its meaning, debate its magnitude, doubt its madness, but none would deny its beauty. The tulip mania, in the end, was not a story of ruin, but a story of reflection. It asked a question that still lingers, quietly, whenever humans assign price, to wonder what is value, and who decides when it blooms and when it fades. The summer of 1858 began like any other in London, hot, sluggish, and faintly anxious. The city was enormous now, swollen to nearly 3 million people, a vast tangle of bricks, chimneys, and narrow streets where carriages rattled, horses switted, and the smell of industry mixed with the sharp tang of coal smoke. But that summer, something different began to hang over the city, something thicker, heavier, and far more offensive than smoke. It was the smell. A smell that did not drift but pressed like a living thing. It came from the river, the Thames, which cut through London like a broad brown artery. For centuries the Thames had been the city's pride, its highway, its water supply, and its mirror. But now it was something else entirely. By the middle of June, the Thames had become a soup of sewage. Every morning, when the sun rose above St. Paul's Cathedral, the light struck a river that no longer sparkled. The surface was sluggish and thick, mottled with scum and the pale bloated bodies of dead animals. The tide pushed the filth back and forth beneath the bridges, spreading the stench through every open window along its banks. At high tide, the river lapped at the steps of the Parliament buildings themselves. There, just beyond the carved stone balustrades, the lawmakers of the British Empire could look down and see the water they had ignored for too long. The smell was indescribable, nose-eating, clinging, unstoppable. Newspapers tried to find the right words. The most horrible and offensive odor imaginable, wrote the Times, a vapor thick enough to cut with a knife. The public called it simply the Great Stink. For centuries, London had treated the Thames as both its source of life and its dumping ground. The medieval city had been small enough for nature to recover. But by the 19th century, London was the largest city in the world, and progress had outpaced sanitation. Every household, rich or poor, had a cesspit, an underground chamber where waste collected. In theory, night soil men were supposed to empty these pits and cart the waste away, but in practice, the job was messy, expensive, and unpleasant. Most people simply let their cesspits overflow, allowing the contents to seep into the ground or, worse still, into nearby wells. When flush toilets became fashionable in the 1840s, the problem multiplied overnight. The waste no longer sat quietly underground. It was washed straight into the city's drains, which emptied, unfiltered, into the Thames. By 1858, tens of thousands of homes, factories, slaughterhouses, and tanneries poured their waste directly into the river. It was, as one observer put it, liquid corruption, and the heat made it worse. That summer was unusually dry and hot, with the sun baking the mudflats of the Thames until they cracked and steamed. The water level dropped, concentrating the filth. The smell rose, dense and sour, filling the streets. People soaked their curtains in chloride of lime to keep out the stench. Shopkeepers closed their doors. River traffic slowed, and the ferrymen held cloths over their faces. Even the fishmongers near Billingsgate Market could not bear to stand near the riverbank. In Parliament, members of the House of Commons hung sheets soaked in disinfectant across the windows. Some debated moving the entire government upriver to Hampton Court, until the crisis passed. One newspaper joked grimly that a few members, if they stay long in the House, may be summoned, but not by their constituents. Yet, for all the horror, the Great Stink did not come as a surprise. It was the final unbearable consequence of years of neglect. The link between water supply and disease had long been suspected, but science had not yet caught up with reality. Most physicians still believed in the miasma theory, the idea that disease spread through bad air, not contaminated water. The cholera epidemics of 1832, 1849, and 1854 had each killed tens of thousands, and yet officials continued to focus on the smell rather than the source. When cholera swept through London, killing 1 in every 50 residents, most believed it was caused by foul vapors rising from the river. They did not yet understand that the true killer was invisible: Vibrio cholera, a bacterium carried in water. Only a few, like the physician Dr. John Snow, dared to challenge this belief. In 1854, during an outbreak in Soho, Snow traced the disease to a single water pump on Broad Street. By mapping cases and interviewing residents, he proved that contaminated water, not air, was the source. When authorities removed the pump handle, the epidemic subsided, but his findings were dismissed by many as coincidence. Miasma, they said, was still the culprit. And so, when the Great Stink arrived, Parliament tried to fight it with perfume. In early June, government clerks ordered barrels of lime to be poured into the Thames to sweeten the water. Crews spread chemicals along the riverbanks, hoping to neutralize the odor. But it was like throwing lavender at a cesspool. The stench only grew worse. The Times ran daily reports, describing the black, opaque fluid that ran beneath Westminster Bridge, the rotting vegetation, the refuse of abattoirs, and the dead fish that floated in the current. It was not just unpleasant, it was dangerous. With every tide, the river carried filth upriver toward the intakes of the city's water companies. The same water used to flush waste was drawn again for drinking. Londoners, unknowingly, were drinking the disease they feared. Among those who took notice was a quiet, methodical engineer named Joseph Bazalgette. Bazalgette was the chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works, a position that carried both immense responsibility and almost no authority. For years, he had proposed a vast new sewer system to carry waste away from the city. But Parliament, reluctant to spend the money, had delayed again and again. The Great Stink changed everything. In the oppressive heat of July 1858, members of Parliament could barely remain in the House of Commons. The smell seeped through the curtains and under the doors, making debate impossible. One by one, even the most stubborn ministers began to agree that something had to be done. The Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, who had long resisted sanitary reform, finally gave in. The matter, he declared, cannot be put off. Within weeks, Parliament passed the Metropolis Local Management Amendment Act, giving Bazalgette the power and the funding to build the largest public works project London had ever attempted. Bazalgette's plan was breathtaking in its simplicity and scale. He proposed a network of 82 miles of main intercepting sewers and over 1,000 miles of smaller sewers, all designed to divert waste eastward, away from central London. Instead of flowing into the Thames at every bend, sewage would be carried by gravity along vast underground tunnels to new outfalls far downstream, where it could be released with the tides. To manage this flow, Bazalgette designed immense pumping stations, cathedrals of engineering built in ornate Victorian style. The most famous, at Crossness and Abbey Mills, would lift millions of gallons of waste each day. It was an audacious vision, but Bazalgette's genius lay in his foresight. He sized the pipes far larger than the current population required, calculating that London would grow, and that his system must endure. His chief engineer's motto was simple: well, we're only going to do this once, and there's always the unforeseen. So he doubled the diameter of the sewers. It was a quiet decision that would serve London for more than a century. Construction began in 1859. The work was slow, dangerous, and relentless. Thousands of labourers dug through clay and gravel, often waist-deep in mud and foul water. Steam engines pumped constantly to keep the tunnels dry. Accidents were common, so were diseases. But Bazalgette pressed on, his meticulous drawings guiding every brick, every pipe. He believed, above all, that engineering could save lives, not through grandeur but through cleanliness. By 1865, sections of the new system were complete, and in 1870, the full network was operational. The waste of millions now flowed east, away from the heart of the city. The Thames began, slowly, to clear. The transformation was so gradual that few noticed at first. The smell faded. The river turned from black to brown, then to grey. By the time Bazalgette died in 1891, The water that flowed past Westminster was once again capable of supporting fish. But in the summer of 1858, when all of this was still just a plan, Londoners could only endure. The heat lingered into August, and the air above the river shimmered with decay. Newspapers warned citizens to stay indoors. Barges carrying cargoes of coal and timber passed silently, their crews covering their faces with handkerchiefs. At Lambeth, a child was seen playing near the shore, poking at the sludge with a stick. A bystander scolded him, but the boy only laughed, saying, "It's just the river!" He did not know that the same river had already carried death through his neighbourhood. By the time the weather broke in September, and the stench began to fade, more than 30,000 Londoners had died from cholera in the previous decade, victims of the same invisible chain that linked waste to water and water to life. The Great Stink, for all its grotesque immediacy, had finally forced the city to look at itself. As night fell over London in that sweltering summer, the river lay quiet and dark beneath the bridges. The lamps along Westminster flickered in the haze, and the air above the Thames trembled like heat over a forge. In the silence, one might imagine the faint hum of the city breathing through its filth, a living organism choking on its own waste, waiting for relief. That relief would come, but not yet. For now, the Thames still flowed, slow and foul, through the heart of the empire, reminding its rulers that even the greatest city in the world could not escape its own dirt. And as the stench rose again the next morning, drifting through the windows of Parliament, one question lingered in the air, an odorless question, sharper than lime, and far harder to ignore. How long could a civilization built on progress survive, when it could not even clean its own river? By the time the Great Stink had reached its most unbearable heights, the Thames was no longer just a nuisance. It was a public crisis that had come to symbolize every flaw of a growing empire. The Victorians prided themselves on progress, on railways, factories, and colonies that stretched across the globe, but their capital city was rotting from within. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. How could Britain claim to lead the world in civilization when its own lawmakers were gagging on the smell of their river? The Great Stink of 1858 did something no reformer, preacher, or doctor had managed before. It made sanitation a political emergency. The Parliament that couldn't breathe on the morning of June 30th, the House of Commons assembled as usual. The heat shimmered off the river, and within minutes the members began to fan themselves. But soon, as the tide turned, the odour rolled in through the open windows like a toxic fog. Benjamin Disraeli, never one to waste a rhetorical moment, stood and remarked dryly that the Thames had become a Stygian pool reeking with ineffable and intolerable horrors. His opponents laughed, but only briefly, then coughed. Within an hour, the session broke up early. Clerks stuffed their noses with handkerchiefs soaked in carbolic acid. One newspaper reported that a few less delicate gentlemen tied sponges around their faces, while others resorted to smearing disinfectant ointments under their mustaches. By mid-July, even the most stubborn deniers had fled the riverside buildings. The smell did not just cling to clothes. It entered the lungs and seemed to stay there. And so, behind closed doors and hastily perfumed chambers, London's elite finally began to admit that something must be done. Not next year, not when funds allowed. Now. The reluctant revolution, in truth. The decision to clean the Thames had been delayed for decades by politics, cost, and indifference. The question was not whether the city needed a sewer system. Everyone knew it did. But who would pay for it? Since the early 1800s, a tangled web of parishes, private companies, and local boards had each managed their own tiny sections of drainage. Each insisted it was not their responsibility to fix the whole. Parliament itself, filled with men of property, was reluctant to tax landowners for what they saw as a problem of the poor. But the Great Stink made excuses impossible. For once, the foulness did not respect class or status. It crept under the doors of the wealthy as easily as it invaded the alleys of the slums. Lord Palmerston, the Prime Minister, had once joked that the smell would provide an excellent excuse for members to go home early. But now, his patience was spent. He summoned the Metropolitan Board of Works, a relatively new organisation responsible for major infrastructure projects, and told its chief engineer, Joseph Bazalgette, to begin work immediately. The government would grant to $3 million, an enormous sum for the time, to cleanse the capital. Thus began one of the largest, least glamorous revolutions in British history, the building of the London sewer system. Joseph Bazalgette, the reluctant hero of cleanliness. Joseph William Bazalgette was not a man of speeches. He was an engineer's engineer, quiet, meticulous, and practical. Born in 1819 to a modest family, he trained as a civil engineer during the great railway boom of the 1840s. The precision of that work, gradients, tunnels, drainage, would serve him well when he turned his attention to sanitation. When Bazalgette took charge of London's drains in 1856, he inherited chaos: thousands of miles of decaying brick culverts, cesspools, and open ditches. His task was not merely to clean them, but to replace them, to create a single, coordinated system that would carry waste far away from the heart of the city. His plan, finalized in 1858, was elegant in its logic. 3 main intercepting sewers would run along the north bank of the Thames. 2 others would run along the south. These would collect all the smaller sewers that currently discharged into the river. The waste would be carried eastward by gravity to enormous pumping stations, where it would be lifted and released downstream. By diverting the flow, the Thames through central London would finally be free from pollution. Bazalgette's approach was not glamorous, but it was revolutionary. He understood something few politicians grasped: sanitation was not just cleanliness, it was civilization itself. Engineering the impossible work began in earnest in 1859. From Battersea to Barking, construction sites sprang up along the river. Steam engines chugged night and day, hauling clay and gravel from deep trenches. Workers, mostly Irish labourers known as navvies, toiled waist deep in mud, often in darkness lit only by oil lamps. The tunnels, lined with millions of hand-laid bricks, snake it for miles beneath the streets. Every curve and slope had to be exact. Too steep and the sewage would rush through too fast, wearing away the walls. Too shallow and it would stagnate. Bazalgette's men used precise gradients, as gentle as 1 in 600, to keep the flow steady. To maintain accuracy, they relied on surveying instruments, spirit levels, and a kind of obsessive attention to detail rarely seen outside cathedral building. It was cathedral work in its own way, a cathedral of filth, hidden underground. Each day, the city above continued its business. Clerks walked to their offices, carriages rattled over cobblestones, and Londoners read the Times without realizing that, deep beneath their feet, an army of men was digging the arteries of a cleaner future. The pumping palaces, the sewers themselves were invisible, but Bazalgette insisted that the pumping stations should be beautiful. If the city must depend on machinery to cleanse itself, he said, then let it be machinery of dignity. 2 great stations were built: Crossness on the south bank and Abbey Mills on the north. Crossness was the more famous, a magnificent structure of red brick and cast iron, decorated with arches, columns, and patterned floors. The ironwork inside, painted in deep greens and reds, gleamed like the interior of a Gothic chapel. Visitors called it the Cathedral of Sewage. There, 4 vast steam engines lifted millions of gallons of waste every day. Each beam weighed over 50 tons and moved with a slow, steady rhythm, like the heartbeat of the city itself. Abbey Mills, equally grand, stood amid marshes east of London. Its tall chimneys and domed roof looked almost like a Byzantine basilica. Beneath it, miles of tunnels converged, the culmination of Bazalgette's vast subterranean network. In their quiet grandeur, these places turned the unmentionable into architecture. The Victorians, who built their churches to glorify God, built their sewers to glorify progress. London's invisible transformation. By 1865, the western section of Bazalgette's system was complete. Almost immediately, the difference was noticeable. The water near Westminster cleared, the oppressive smell faded. Even the riverbanks began to lose their oily sheen. When a new cholera outbreak hit East London in 1866, the results were undeniable. The disease struck the one district not yet connected to the new sewers, the very area still relying on polluted water from the Thames. Everywhere else, cholera had all but disappeared. For the first time, London's citizens began to grasp the link between sanitation and health. Even those who still believed in miasma could not ignore the evidence before their noses, or rather, the lack of it. Clean water, it turned out, meant clean air. The cost of progress: the project stretched over a decade, costing far more than its original estimate. Critics complained of overspending, delays, and inconvenience. Yet Bazalgette persisted, rarely seeking praise. In all, his system used more than 300 million bricks, 2.7 million cubic yards of earth, and 318 million gallons of concrete. Thousands of workers died or were injured during construction, accidents, explosions, even disease. But when the final outfall opened at Barking Creek in 1875, London had achieved what many had thought impossible: a modern, functioning sewer network serving over 3 million people. It would continue to serve millions more for the next century and beyond. The return of the river as the years passed. The Thames slowly recovered. The thick black sludge gave way to brown currents, then green. By the late 1880s, fish returned to parts of the river that had been lifeless for generations. Rowers once again took to the water. Ferrymen reopened their roads. The river that had nearly killed the city became its lifeline once more. Even so, the memory of the Great Stink lingered. Older Londoners spoke of that summer as if it were a shared nightmare, a season when progress itself seemed to rot. It was said that in certain corners of Westminster, when the wind blew just right, one could still catch a faint, ghostly trace of the smell, not enough to offend, just enough to remind. The silent revolution, the Great Stink, was more than a tale of smell and sewage. It marked the moment when London, and by extension, much of the modern world, began to understand that public health was not a private matter. It was the beginning of what historians later called the sanitary revolution, the idea that government had a duty to protect the health of its citizens, not just their property or liberty. From Bazalgette sewers came new water laws, housing reforms, and urban planning systems across Europe and America. The unseen, unglamorous work beneath London's streets became a model for cities from Paris to New York. And yet, it remained invisible, a miracle no one noticed, precisely because it worked so well. Bazalgette himself received a knighthood in 1875, but he remained humble. "It's only pipes and brickwork," he said once. Nothing romantic about it. He was wrong, of course. There was romance in it. The romance of quiet service, of the human need to build something that lasts. Even today, much of London still depends on Bazalgette's network. The great tunnels still carry their endless burden eastward, day after day, as they have since the reign of Queen Victoria. Echoes beneath the city. If you walk along the Thames embankment today, one of Bazalgette's greatest surface achievements, it's easy to forget that the promenade itself hides miles of sewer tunnels below. The road, the gardens, even the lampposts follow the path of buried pipes. On quiet evenings, when the city hums with the low, constant rhythm of traffic, one might imagine another hum beneath. The slow, eternal movement of water through brick and darkness. That hum is the true legacy of the Great Stink, not a story of filth, but of endurance. Because what London learned that summer was not simply that its river was dirty, but that progress itself required maintenance. That civilization, like the Thames, must be cleansed again and again, lest it stagnate. By the time Joseph Bazalgette retired, Londoners no longer spoke of the Great Stink. The horror had become history. Yet in that silence, something remarkable had changed. A new kind of respect for the invisible work that keeps a city alive. But there was one question that lingered quietly beneath the cobblestones and iron bridges of the Thames. Would London remember why it had once stunk? Or would it, in time, grow complacent again? When the last of Joseph Bazalgette's tunnels was sealed and the pumps began to hum steadily beneath London's streets, the city above hardly noticed. There were no parades, no grand unveiling, no cheering crowds. The Thames still looked brown, the fog still rolled in thick from the river, and the air still smelled faintly of coal. And yet, something profound had changed. For the first time in centuries, London's river, that long suffering mirror of the metropolis, began to heal. The Great Stink had passed, leaving behind not just a cleaner river, but a cleaner idea of what it meant to be modern. A river remembered in the quiet years after 1870, the Thames was no longer a scandal. Barges moved along it again, carrying coal, timber, and grain to the warehouses of the East End. Fishermen cautiously returned to the shallows, though most of the fish were small and pale, survivors of decades of pollution. There was still a faint, earthy odor near low tide, a smell of mud and history, but it no longer drove people indoors. Children played along the embankments. Couples strolled where once only sewage had flowed. Even Parliament, which had once nearly evacuated in disgust, could open its windows in summer again. In a city obsessed with progress, the recovery of the river was not celebrated with fireworks or speeches, but with a kind of quiet pride. A recognition that the metropolis had outgrown its own waste. Still, the memory lingered. The Great Stink became one of those stories Londoners told each other in disbelief, as though it belonged to another world entirely. "Can you imagine," wrote one newspaper in 1889, "that once upon a time the Thames itself was a sewer?" The answer, of course, was yes, but few wanted to remember. 2. A city beneath a city. As the decades passed, London's population continued to grow, and with it, the unseen system beneath the streets expanded. By the dawn of the 20th century, nearly 4 million people depended on Bazalgette's sewers. The tunnels had become part of the city's anatomy, as vital as its roads and railways, yet almost entirely forgotten. Tourists admired Westminster Abbey and St. Paul's Cathedral, but few realized that beneath them ran miles of brick-lined arteries carrying the waste of an empire. Engineers who studied Bazalgette's design were astonished by its durability. His insistence on doubling the pipe diameter had seemed excessive at the time. Now, it was prophetic. The sewers still had room to spare. When later generations of engineers inspected the tunnels, they found them nearly perfect. The bricks still solid, the mortar still holding fast after 50 years of use. The system had been built not for convenience, but for permanence. In the age of steam and soot, that kind of endurance was rare. It was as if Bazalgette had designed for eternity. 3. The unseen heroes. But Bazalgette was not alone in his crusade for cleanliness. The Great Stink had also awakened a generation of public health reformers, scientists, and social thinkers who began to see sanitation not just as engineering, but as moral duty. Figures like Florence Nightingale, who had witnessed the horrors of infection during the Crimean War, championed hygiene as the foundation of civilization. The first essential of civilization, she wrote, is cleanliness. Meanwhile, the work of Dr. John Snow, long dismissed by the medical establishment, was finally recognized for what it was, a revelation. His meticulous maps of cholera outbreaks, once controversial, were now seen as the birth of modern epidemiology. Together, these figures changed not only London but the world. Their ideas inspired similar reforms in Paris, Hamburg, New York, and Tokyo. The age of modern public health, with its drains, waterworks, and disinfectants, had begun. And yet, for all its progress, it remained an invisible revolution. The people who benefited most never saw the pipes that saved their lives. That was the paradox of Bazalgette's achievement. His success was measured by the degree to which no one noticed it. 4. The river and the empire. By the late Victorian period, the Thames had regained much of its dignity. Writers began once again to describe it as the silver thread through London, though in truth it was more of a dull pewter. Still, it was clean enough to serve as a symbol of imperial pride. Paintings showed the Houses of Parliament reflected in its waters. Travel writers spoke of it as the artery of the world's greatest city. Steamships from every continent docked at its wharves. Tea from India, cotton from Egypt, sugar from the Caribbean, all passed through its tidal gates. And beneath it all, unseen and unheralded, Bazalgette's tunnels carried away the city's waste, day after day, without fail. In this way, the Thames became a metaphor for the empire itself, majestic on the surface, supported by endless unseen labor below. 5. The return of disease. But history, like the tide, always returns. In 1893, another cholera scare swept across Europe. Though London was largely spared, panic spread quickly. Old fears resurfaced. Could the disease return through the water? Was the river truly clean? Inspectors tested the outflows and found that the sewage, though carried away from the city, still polluted the estuary downstream. The system had worked for London, but not for the communities beyond. The lesson was uncomfortable. Even good engineering had limits. Cleanliness, like progress, could never be finished. It required vigilance. Thus began the next phase of the sanitary movement: treatment, not just transport. By the early 20th century, new pumping stations at Beckton and Crossness added filtration and chemical processing to the sewage flow. The river's health improved again, slowly but surely. Each innovation built on the quiet legacy of 1858, the year the Thames had finally forced its people to change. 6. The hidden aesthetics of cleanliness. In the mid-20th century, as London modernized, much of Bazalgette's infrastructure was upgraded, yet his original design remained largely intact. Architects marveled at its beauty, the symmetry of brickwork, the mathematical precision of the arches, the serene geometry of its tunnels. Some even compared it to Roman aqueducts or medieval cathedrals. But the Victorians had not built it for beauty. They had built it for order, the quiet reassurance that even filth could be contained. It was this aesthetic of control, the idea that a great city could regulate its own decay, that defined the late 19th century. To the Victorians, cleanliness was not simply next to godliness, it was godliness, expressed through pipes and steam. Every manhole cover, every iron vent, every stone embankment along the Thames whispered the same message: we have mastered our own waste. 7. A legacy in brick and mortar. When Sir Joseph Bazalgette died in 1891, his obituary in the Times was respectful but restrained. He was praised for his great public works and improvement of the capital's health, but the tone was subdued. Perhaps that was fitting. Bazalgette himself had never sought fame. He was buried at St. Mary's Church in Wimbledon. On his tombstone, the inscription is simple: engineer of the London main drainage system. Yet his true memorial lies elsewhere, beneath every London street. in the quiet tunnels that have carried away more than a century's worth of filth. A modern engineer once said that if you removed Bazalgette's system overnight, London would become uninhabitable within 3 days. 3 days. That is all it would take for civilization to collapse back into the chaos from which it rose. That is the measure of his legacy. 8. Remembering the smell in the 20th century, Londoners mostly forgot the Great Stink. Children growing up after World War II could hardly believe that the same river where they fed ducks had once been lethal. Teachers told them about cholera, about cesspits and night soil men, but it sounded like myth. Yet now and then during dry summers when the river level dropped and the air hung heavy, a faint odor would rise again from the mudflats, a whisper from 1858. It was not dangerous anymore, only nostalgic, the ghost of an age when progress reeked. And perhaps that faint smell served a purpose. It reminded the city that cleanliness is never permanent. The river, patient and ancient, always waits 9. The modern river today, the Thames, is cleaner than it has been in 400 years. Otters and seahorses have returned to its waters. The fish that vanished in the 19th century now thrive again beneath the bridges. Tourists take boat rides past Westminster and marvel at the view, never imagining that just below their feet runs the same network of sewers designed nearly 2 centuries ago. The city above has changed beyond recognition. Skyscrapers, electric lights, and digital screens, but the city beneath still carries the same ancient duty. When modern engineers inspect the tunnels, they often remark how quiet it is. The only sound is the slow, eternal flow of water through brick, the sound of civilization humming softly below. 10. Reflections in the water. The Great Stink of 1858 was, by all accounts, one of the most unpleasant events in London's history. But it also revealed something essential about humanity: that discomfort, when shared widely enough, becomes a force for change. The Victorians did not reform their city out of pure moral conviction. They did it because they could no longer bear the smell. And yet, from that simple act of disgust came one of the greatest public health achievements of the modern age. Progress, it seems, often begins not with inspiration, but with inconvenience. The Great Stink forced a civilization to confront its own waste, to acknowledge that beneath the polished surfaces of industry, an empire lay something rank and human, something that demanded attention. It taught London, and perhaps the world, that cleanliness was not just aesthetic, it was ethical. As the Thames glides beneath its bridges today, smooth, grey and silent, it carries with it the memory of every generation that has lived beside it. The river no longer stinks, but if you lean over the railing on a warm summer night and imagine the air of 1858, thick, hot, unbearable, you might feel a shiver of gratitude for the unseen world below, and you might wonder, if the Great Stink could drive a city to cleanse itself, what unseen problems, festering quietly today, might be waiting for their own summer of reckoning. You find yourself on a cobbled road somewhere in the damp north of the Holy Roman Empire, in the middle of the 13th century. The road wends gently through flat farmland and scrubby forests, not far from the Baltic coast. Carts creak in the distance, heavy wooden things with rough, spoked wheels and the smell of oxen following behind them. The air carries a faint tang of salt, though the sea is miles away. That salt is important. It is, in a sense, the reason for the road itself, and soon enough, for one of the quietest and most influential alliances Europe ever knew. The Hanseatic League did not begin with flags or battle cries. It began with merchants trying to keep their goods dry. In the 1100s, salt was more valuable than silver. It preserved fish, cured meats, and made long northern winters survivable. The salt mines near Oeneberg, deep inland, produced mountains of the stuff. But the real wealth came when that salt reached the sea. From there, it would be loaded onto ships in Lübeck, a city perched between the Trave and Wakenitz rivers, and carried to Scandinavia and beyond. Lübeck's people, shipbuilders, traders, and warehouse clerks, began to realize that trade routes, not titles, were the true veins of power. In a Europe divided among squabbling princes and bishops, these traders built something different: a network of trust, ledgers, and letters. Lübeck called itself the Queen of the Hanse, but at this early stage, there was no league yet, just a growing cluster of northern cities, Hamburg, Bremen, Riga, Danzig, now Gdansk, that traded together, protected one another's merchants, and began to speak a common language of commerce. The Hanse's world was not the bright marble of Florence or Venice. It was grey timber, wet docks, and the clink of scales measuring fish and rye. These were not noblemen but burghers, townspeople bound by contracts and ledgers. And though their lives seemed dull, their methods would shape European capitalism itself. By the 1200s, merchants from Lübeck had started using standard weights and measures in their markets. They developed a reputation for honesty, or at least reliable record keeping, which meant other cities wanted to trade with them. What started as mutual protection for sea traders slowly became a confederation of towns stretching from Bruges in the west to Novgorod in the east. Each city had its own council and customs, but they began sending envoys to Lübeck to coordinate shipping laws, taxes, and trade disputes. Over time, these meetings became more formal, turning into the Hanseatic Diet, a sort of merchant parliament. But for now, in the 13th century, things were still loose. The Baltic was full of pirates known as Vitalian Badur, or Victual Brothers. They pried on merchant ships, demanding payment or stealing cargo outright. To defend themselves, the merchants of Lübeck and Hamburg joined forces, not under any crown, but under mutual agreement. Their goal was simple: protect trade, maintain prices, and make sure every merchant could return home alive. When you look at the Hanseatic League today, it's tempting to imagine grandeur, banners flapping in the wind over tall ships. In truth, it was a world of warehouses and ledgers, of merchants sitting in low taverns discussing tariffs by candlelight. The Hanse's power grew not from conquest but from repetition, from the steady rhythm of ships loading grain, salt, timber, and furs. In their quiet efficiency, they began to shape the North Sea economy. Even kings had to take notice. By the mid-13th century, the merchants of Lübeck had gained privileges in London, Bergen, and Bruges. These were not colonial powers but commercial enclaves, known as konters, small offices where Hanse merchants could live and trade under their own laws. The most famous was the Steelyard in London, a walled compound along the Thames where German traders kept records, money, and beer. Through these konters, the Hanseatic League began to knit Europe together. London's wool fed Flemish weavers in Bruges. Flemish cloth wrapped the merchants of Danzig. Danzig's grain fed Scandinavia. And in return, the north sent timber, fish, and iron south. The League had no capital city, no army, and no emperor. It had only ships, trust, and the slow accumulation of power through contracts. To outsiders, it seemed dull, an endless dance of tariffs and trade routes. But to those who understood, it was revolutionary. Lübeck itself became a city of quiet precision. Its warehouses were carefully aligned along the river, each one built of red brick, a rarity in northern Europe at the time. Inside, every barrel was labeled and every ledger meticulously copied. The sound of scratching quills echoed through the counting houses late into the night. The merchants knew that information was their greatest weapon. Ships sailed only when the winds were favorable, and letters carried news of markets weeks ahead of their rivals. To be a good Hanseatic merchant was not to be bold, but to be patient. Still, danger lingered on the sea. Pirates could ruin a shipment worth a year's profits. Winter storms could smash ships to kindling, and city politics were fickle. A single dispute over tolls could block an entire river. That is why in 1241, Lübeck and Hamburg signed a formal alliance, a pact that would eventually grow into the Hanseatic League. The treaty promised mutual protection and coordination in trade. It was modest, even bureaucratic in tone. Yet from that dry agreement came centuries of prosperity. By the 1300s, nearly 200 towns were part of the Hanseatic network. They shared trade privileges, shipping lanes, and a code of conduct. They even standardized the type of beer brewed for export, known as Hanse beer, a dark, heavy ale meant to survive the journey north. It was, in many ways, a European union of merchants, a cooperative born not of politics but of necessity. And yet the League's greatest strength, its quiet, decentralized nature, would one day become its weakness. As empires rose and states centralized power, the Hanse's loose bonds would begin to fray. But for now, in the 13th and early 14th centuries, its ships sailed from the Baltic to the North Sea, carrying the pulse of commerce with them. The cobbled road to Lübeck remains busy. The smell of salt grows stronger as you near the docks. You can almost hear the slow rhythm of barrels being rolled, the faint echo of merchants tollying cargo in the dusk. They could not know it then, but their ledgers and letters were reshaping Europe, one shipment at a time. And as Lübeck's merchants looked eastward toward the frozen Gulf of Finland, they began to wonder, could their quiet system of trade stretch even further? Could they tame the distant markets of Novgorod and the strange people who lived there? By the middle of the 14th century, the Hanseatic League had grown into something far larger than anyone had intended. It was not an empire, not even truly an organization in the modern sense, but a web, spun quietly across the cold waters of the north. Its threads ran through harbors, counting houses and guild halls, and at every node, Men with ink-stained fingers weighed the worth of the world in ledgers. The League's success depended on a simple truth. In an age of kings and knights, trade required peace. A noble could win land by war, but a merchant could lose a fortune with a single raid. Thus the League learned to buy what it could not fight for. Privileges, toll exemptions, even the right to its own laws. To understand its power, you must imagine Europe before nations, a patchwork of duchies, bishoprics, and tiny republics. Travel 20 miles, and the coins might change, cross a river, and the language might shift. Yet Hanseatic merchants managed to move goods from Flanders to Russia as though the continent were one long market street. Their ships, broad-bellied cogs built of oak, sailed from port to port, carrying salt, wool, rye, amber, and furs. Each cog was slow, square, and stubborn but reliable, built to endure ice and storms rather than speed. When docked, they looked less like instruments of exploration and more like floating barns. But inside were bales of cloth, casks of herring, and barrels of beer, the building blocks of medieval prosperity. And at the far edge of their trade routes lay Novgorod. Novgorod was not like the tidy brick towns of the Baltic. It was vast and wooden, stretching along the Volkhov River. A city of markets, monasteries, and ringing bells. To the Hanseatic merchants, it was the gateway to the east, to Russian furs, beeswax, and hemp. The journey there was long and cold, and few foreigners stayed through the winter. The Hanseatic merchants who did brave it lived in a walled enclave called the Peterhof. It was not a palace but a timber compound, with its own chapel, warehouse, and sleeping quarters. No women were allowed inside, and the merchants were forbidden to mingle with locals except for trade. Each day was carefully regimented. Bells marked the hours for meals and work. Letters were sealed with wax and sent by courier along frozen rivers. To outsiders, the Peterhof seemed almost monastic, a colony of clerks and traders who lived by the rhythm of contracts. But to the League it was a vital artery. The furs of Novgorod fetched high prices in Bruges and London, where nobles demanded ermine for their robes. And so, for centuries, the Hanse kept the Peterhof running, through snow, isolation, and the occasional suspicion of Russian princes. Back west, the League's influence deepened. Lübeck became its de facto capital, and the Hanseatic Diet met there regularly. Delegates from cities across the north gathered to discuss shipping rights, coinage, and disputes. The minutes of those meetings, preserved in neat Gothic script, are some of the most quietly bureaucratic documents in history, yet they governed half the trade of Northern Europe. One such meeting, recorded in 1361, reveals the League's growing assertiveness. That year, King Valdemar V of Denmark seized the island of Gotland and plundered Visby, a key Hanseatic port. The merchants were furious. Rather than beg the king for restitution, they organized a blockade. Dozens of Hanseatic ships sailed into Danish waters, cutting off trade. It was in its way a war, but a war fought with prices instead of pikes. The blockade worked. 2 years later, the Danish king was forced to sign the Treaty of Stralsund, restoring privileges and paying reparations. The League had proven that commerce could wield power as surely as any army. And yet, even in its triumph, the League remained deliberately boring. Its success depended on predictability, on the slow and steady rhythm of trade. Cities like Bremen and Danzig grew wealthy, but rarely flamboyant. Their streets were lined not with palaces but with warehouses, churches, and guildhalls. Each town had its merchants' guild, called a Kaufleut. Membership required proof of honesty, capital, and often a father or uncle already in the trade. Young apprentices spent years learning arithmetic, Latin, and law before they were allowed to keep their own ledgers. Their tools were simple, quills, wax seals, and abacuses, but their network was vast. A merchant in Riga could send a letter to Lübeck detailing grain prices, and within weeks, the information would ripple through the entire League. Decisions were rarely made in haste. In the Hanseatic world, patience was a virtue as valuable as gold. The cities themselves shared certain characteristics, a particular kind of order. Most were built around a central market square with a tall church steeple nearby. Their warehouses faced the water, with tall, narrow gables designed for hoisting cargo to upper floors. The architecture was practical, yet strangely beautiful in its symmetry, but underneath that quiet efficiency lay tension. The League's charter promised equality among its member cities, yet Lübeck increasingly dominated. Smaller ports grumbled that the Queen of the Hanse set taxes and policies to favor her own merchants. Still they stayed. For all its politics, the League offered safety and profit. To trade outside it meant risk, higher tolls, fewer protections, and no recourse if your goods were seized. Within the League, at least, there were rules. By the late 1300s, the Hanseatic League had become something Europe had never seen before, a federation of city-states bound not by land but by commerce. Its ships supplied grain to famine-struck England, timber for the Low Countries and iron to Scandinavia. Its beer filled the taverns of the North Sea coast. Even the word Hans itself became a mark of reliability, stamped on barrels and documents like a brand. But cracks were beginning to form. The world was changing slowly, almost imperceptibly, but enough for the merchants to notice. In Flanders, new banking families were emerging, dealing in letters of credit rather than physical goods. In England, royal charters began to favour native traders over foreign ones, and in the south, the merchants of Venice and Genoa were exploring far richer markets beyond Europe. The Hanse's methods, so successful in a world of slow ships and careful ledgers, began to seem old-fashioned. Still, for now the League endured, its diets meeting its warehouses full, its ships creaking across the grey waters of the Baltic. The merchants of Lobeck could not yet imagine that the tides of trade would one day turn against them. They believed their system was eternal, as steady as the northern winds, and perhaps, as they sat in their candlelit halls, tallying accounts and signing contracts, some of them wondered, could their league, born of trust and trade, survive in a Europe that was learning to be ruled by kings again? By the 15th century, the Hanseatic League had reached the height of its influence. Nearly 200 cities, from London to Bergen, from Riga to Bruges, were part of its sprawling web. Its merchants spoke Low German, carried common contracts, and trusted the red wax seal that marked a document as Hanseatic. From the outside, it appeared unshakable, a quiet giant ruling the northern seas through habit, patience, and the steady movement of ships. But beneath the surface, change was already spreading like cracks in the ice. The very things that had made the League strong, its local autonomy, its reliance on trust instead of central authority, were becoming weaknesses. Europe was no longer a patchwork of small powers. Kings were growing stronger, parliaments were forming, and borders were hardening. The Hanseatic League had thrived in the spaces between states. But as those spaces closed, its ships found themselves trapped between competing national ambitions. The quiet enemies of trade in England, the rise of native merchant guilds, and the growing confidence of the crown began to challenge the League's privileges. For centuries, Hanseatic traders had enjoyed their own compound on the Thames, the Steelyard, exempt from many local taxes. They were permitted to live under their own laws, guarded by their own watchmen, and to trade freely in English wool and tin. But by the late 1400s, resentment had grown. English merchants, particularly those of the Merchant Adventurers Company, complained that the Hanse enjoyed unfair advantages. They argued that the Steelyard was a foreign state on English soil. In 1475, King Edward IV revoked many of their privileges. Trade continued, but the tone had changed. The English wanted their own merchants to control the nation's exports. The same pattern repeated elsewhere. In the Netherlands, Bruges began to lose its harbour to silt, and Antwerp rose as the new centre of trade, a city where Italian and Spanish bankers replaced Hanseatic bookkeepers. In Scandinavia, the Swedish crown grew tired of Hanseatic tolls and interference. The League, built on mutual consent, had no mechanism to fight back effectively. It could blockade ports or suspend trade, but kings could now afford to endure such pressure. Meanwhile, new powers were rising on the sea. The Portuguese and Spanish discoveries in the Atlantic shifted Europe's trade routes southward. The Baltic, once the heart of commerce, began to feel isolated. The ships that had once carried salt and grain now seemed small beside the ocean, going caravels sailing toward India and the Americas. And the Hanse's merchants, bound by rules designed for safety and predictability, were slow to adapt. They trusted routine, the same ports, the same ships, the same contracts. They measured profit not in daring ventures but in steady returns. That conservatism, which had been their strength for centuries, now held them back. The Baltic Wars still, the League did not die quietly. It tried, as any institution does, to preserve itself through formality and order. In 1368, during the League's earlier struggles with Denmark, the cities had proven they could act militarily when necessary. The so-called Hanseatic War saw a fleet of merchant ships refitted for battle. They captured Copenhagen, forced the Danish king into peace, and secured decades of privileges. But that success could not be repeated indefinitely. By the 1500s, member cities were increasingly acting on their own. Some, like Hamburg, grew rich and independent, trading directly with England and the Low Countries. Others, like Stralsund and Rostock, declined, their harbours silting up and their merchants bankrupt. Lübeck, the League's proud leader, clung to its traditions. Its council refused to modernize its fleet or loosen its rigid trade laws. As the world embraced open markets and long-distance ventures, Lübeck's merchants remained cautious, bound by the routines that had once made them great. The 30 Years' War, 1648, delivered the final blow. The war devastated trade across northern Europe, and the League, lacking armies or strong allies, could do little to protect its roads. Many of its member cities were occupied or bankrupted. When peace finally returned, the League was a shadow of itself. Its ships still sailed, its ledgers still filled, but the unity was gone. In 1669, the last Hanseatic Diet was held in Lübeck. Only a few cities sent delegates: Bremen, Hamburg, and Lübeck itself. The minutes of that meeting survived polite, formal, and resigned. There was no declaration of dissolution. The League simply faded into silence as its members turned their eyes to other futures. The echo of the Hanse, yet the League's legacy did not vanish. It lingered, quietly, in the habits of trade and law that Europe adopted. The idea of free cities cooperating through agreements rather than domination inspired later confederations. The League's use of standardized contracts, shipping codes, and dispute resolution foreshadowed modern commercial law. Even centuries later, when Napoleon's armies swept through Germany, Lübeck and Hamburg still called themselves free Hanseatic cities. That title survives to this day, written on their coats of arms, a memory of a time when merchants ruled not by sword or decree, but by ledger. To walk through Lübeck now is to feel that quiet past beneath your feet. Its old warehouses still line the Trave River, their stepped gables reflected in the water. Inside, where merchants once counted barrels and weighed bales of flax, there are now museums and cafes. But the rhythm of commerce remains. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the creak of the old cogs, the slow knock of barrels rolling onto docks, the murmur of men speaking Low German in the mist. The Hanseatic League never sought glory, yet it shaped the northern world. It proved that stability, trust, and bureaucracy, all the dull virtues, could build an empire more enduring than many won through conquest. And perhaps that is why its story feels strangely modern. For in the quiet offices of today's corporations, in the meetings of trade unions and economic councils, you can still hear the echo of the Hanse. The belief that order and cooperation, however tedious, can rule the world. The League did not end in war or fire, but in minutes written by candlelight, signed by men who believed that keeping the peace, and the accounts, mattered more than fame. In the end, that was its triumph, and its undoing. You open your eyes to the bright glare of a Mediterranean sun, and the faint smell of olive oil and marble dust. It is the year 46 BCE, or perhaps 45, though even the Romans themselves are not entirely sure. In the city of Rome, where time is supposed to be measured by order and decree, the calendar has slipped badly out of step with the seasons. The priests of the old republic, called pontifices, are the keepers of the Roman calendar. For centuries, they have adjusted the year as they saw fit, adding extra months when the harvest came too early or the festivals no longer matched the weather. But politics and human error have taken their toll. By this point, the Roman calendar is a chaos of miscounted days. The harvest festival might fall in spring, and the planting rites in autumn. Magistrates, who serve one-year terms, find their offices drifting into unpredictable seasons. Farmers no longer know when to sow or reap. It is in short a bureaucratic disaster, one that only a conqueror could fix. Enter Julius Caesar. Caesar had returned from Egypt not just with Cleopatra, but with an idea. The Egyptian astronomers measured time by the stars, not by politics. Their year was a clean 365 days, with an extra day every 4 years to account for the small imperfection of the sun's path. The Roman calendar, by contrast, was based on lunar cycles, months that wobbled against the solar year like a poorly kept clock. Caesar, ever the reformer, decided to bring order. He summoned the best mathematicians and astronomers he could find, including a Greek named Sosigenes of Alexandria. Together they created what the world would later call the Julian calendar. The reform was radical. It redefined the very structure of the Roman year. From now on, the calendar would have 12 fixed months and a total of 365 days, with one additional day every 4 years, what we now call a leap year. It seems obvious now, but in its time it was revolutionary. For the first time, Rome, and much of the Western world, had a calendar that ran on its own, independent of human meddling. The stars, not the priests, would keep time. Yet implementing this simple idea required one of the strangest bureaucratic maneuvers in history. To bring the calendar back in line with the seasons, Caesar had to add an extraordinary number of days to the current year. The year 46 BCE was made 445 days long, later known as the Year of Confusion. It was in effect a year and a half of civic time, stretched out like warm wax to realign the seasons with the sun. Imagine living through that. Festivals that normally came once per year arrived twice. The tax collectors had to adjust their ledgers. Consuls found their terms extended without precedent. The farmers, who had always looked to the priests for guidance, now had to trust a new system that no one fully understood. But slowly, it worked. The sun returned to its rightful place in the Roman calendar. Spring once again arrived in the right month. The people of Rome, who had long measured their lives by rituals and feast days, began to internalize this new order. Time itself had become a kind of imperial conquest, a system imposed from above, logical and permanent. And yet, the new order was not perfect. Sosigenes' calculation assumed that the solar year was exactly 365.25 days long. In truth, it is slightly shorter, about 365.2422 days. The difference was minuscule, but across centuries it would accumulate. For now, however, the Romans celebrated the reform as one of Caesar's greatest legacies. The months we still use today, January for Janus, March for Mars, July for Julius himself, were cemented in stone. The world's most durable bureaucracy had finally mastered time. But the priests and pontifices, those stripped of their calendar powers, did not vanish. They still managed the sacred days, the fasti, and the long lists of festivals. They kept track of which days were dies fasti, days on which courts could meet, and dies nefastia, days reserved for the gods. Even under the new system, the rhythm of the calendar remained deeply religious. The Julian calendar outlived Caesar himself. When he was assassinated in 44 BCE, the system continued, quietly, mechanically, as though indifferent to the deaths of its creators. That, perhaps, was its true genius, a machine of time that no longer needed the living to maintain it. Yet over the centuries, the tiny flaw Sosigenes had left began to show. A drift of just 11 minutes per year meant that, after a few hundred years, the equinoxes, the points when day and night are equal, began to move slowly away from their proper calendar dates. By the 4th century CE, the spring equinox, which had fallen on March 25 in Caesar's day, was now occurring around March 21. Few noticed at first. The Roman Empire was vast and its concerns were earthly: taxes, borders, armies. But after the empire's fall, time became sacred again. In monasteries from Gaul to Ireland, monks began to track the skies. They cared deeply about the equinox because it determined the date of Easter, the most important feast in Christendom. The Church calculated Easter as the first Sunday after the first full moon following the spring equinox, a formula that depended on precise astronomical timing. So when the equinox began to drift, confusion followed. Easter crept backward through the year, and the holy calendar began to lose its alignment with the heavens. In a world that measured holiness by celestial order, this was no small problem. Across the Middle Ages, church scholars debated how to fix it. Tables of calculations were copied and recopied by hand. Computus, they called it, the art of computing time. Monks in cold scriptoria counted the days of the moon, marking each cycle on parchment with careful ink. It was slow, quiet work, the kind that took centuries to notice a pattern. By the 13th century, the error had grown to nearly a full week, but the machinery of time was not easily adjusted. The Julian calendar had ruled Europe for over 1,000 years. To change it would mean altering the rhythm of every festival, every saint's day, every harvest and contract. Still, the question lingered, whispered in universities, monasteries and court see. If the heavens were drifting away from the church's calendar, which one should be trusted? The stars, or the system men had built to measure them? It was a question no one could answer without risking the authority of both church and empire. And yet, as Europe entered the Renaissance, one man, and one pope, would decide to try. It is the late 16th century, and the air in Rome carries the scent of parchment and wax. The Vatican's astronomers climb narrow staircases each evening to the tops of their towers, carrying brass instruments and lanterns. From there they trace the sky. The stars have begun to betray the calendar, or perhaps the calendar has betrayed the stars. The old Julian system has been in use for 16 centuries. Its drift of 11 minutes per year has now accumulated to 10 full days. The spring equinox, which once marked March 25, now occurs on March 11. For the Church, this is no minor inconvenience. It throws off the calculation of Easter, and with it, the sequence of all the other movable feasts that depend on Easter's timing. The issue has been known for generations. Scholars had proposed small corrections since the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, but inertia and politics always intervened. To change the calendar was to rewrite the rhythm of Christian life. It meant telling every farmer, merchant, and priest that their days had been wrong all along. But Pope Gregory C., a careful man with a taste for order, decided the time had come. Gregory convened a commission of experts in astronomy and mathematics to study the problem. Among them was Christopher Clavius, a German Jesuit mathematician, methodical, patient, and deeply aware of how small numbers could shift the world. Their task was monumental in its simplicity, to realign human time with the heavens. After years of observation and calculation, the commission proposed a solution. The new system would retain the 365-day year and the leap year every 4 years, but with a refinement. Centuries divisible by 100 would not be leap years, unless they were also divisible by 400. It was a subtle mathematical tweak that brought the calendar's drift almost perfectly in line with the solar year. Still, even with this correction, there remained the problem of the accumulated 10-day error. The only way to fix it was brutal in its elegance to erase those 10 days from existence. And so, Pope Gregory XIII issued his decree. The papal bull Inter Gravissimus, dated February 24, 1582, declared that Thursday, October 4, 1582, would be followed not by October 5, but by October 15. 10 days simply gone. You can imagine the confusion. People went to bed on a Thursday and awoke on a Friday 10 days later. Those with birthdays during the missing span lost their celebrations entirely. Rent was still due for the full month, though the days themselves had vanished. In Spain and Italy, merchants carefully annotated their ledgers to note the gap. Some peasants muttered that the Pope had stolen time itself, but for the Church the correction was necessary, an act of cosmic housekeeping. The equinox returned to March 21, the date it had held at the time of the early councils. Easter could once again be computed properly. And yet, not everyone agreed to follow Rome's command. Protestant Europe, still smouldering from the Reformation, saw the papal calendar as a tool of Catholic control. England, the German principalities, and much of Scandinavia refused to adopt it. The new calendar was mocked as the popish invention. Thus began the great calendrical divide, a schism not of faith but of days. By the end of 1582, only the Catholic nations, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and Poland, had switched. France joined soon after, adjusting its days between December 9 and 20. The rest of Europe watched with suspicion. For a century and a half, two calendars coexisted uneasily, side by side, their dates slowly diverging. Imagine trying to trade across borders in such a world. Letters arriving from France seemed to come from the future, their dates 10 days ahead. Treaties required double dating, old style for the Julian system, new style for the Gregorian. The confusion became part of daily life. Even death, it seemed, obeyed different calendars. The English poet John Milton was born on December 9, 1608, old style, but by the Gregorian reckoning, that was December 19. Isaac Newton's birthday, too, shifted forward by 11 days after England's eventual adoption. The great men of science themselves could not agree on when they had been born. Meanwhile, the Vatican astronomers continued their quiet work. Clavius and his colleagues published detailed tables to help priests calculate feast days under the new system. They measured the moon's cycles, the positions of the stars, the duration of eclipses, all to ensure that the calendar would stay faithful to the heavens. But in Protestant lands, resistance persisted. To many, the calendar was not simply about time, it was about allegiance. To adopt the papal system was to submit symbolically to Rome, and so the old Julian calendar lingered on, even as the season slipped further and further out of step. Scotland switched in 1600. Germany adopted it in stages, region by region, through the 17th century. Sweden, attempting to transition gradually, made such a mess of it that for several years they celebrated February 30. And England, ever cautious, ever stubborn, refused entirely. The English calendar remained Julian for nearly 200 more years. The delay meant that by the 1700s, England was now 11 days behind continental Europe. Merchants found themselves out of sync with trade partners. Scientists, comparing astronomical data, struggled to reconcile observations taken on different dates, and the rest of the world quietly moved on without them. When England finally decided to act, it did so in the most bureaucratic way imaginable. In 1751, Parliament passed the Calendar New Style Act. It declared that September 2, 1752 would be followed by September 14. 11 days vanished. The law also shifted the start of the legal new year from March 25 to January 1, aligning England with much of the world. For most people, it was a curiosity, not a catastrophe. But popular legend insists that crowds gathered in protest, shouting, "Give us our 11 days!" Whether true or not, the phrase became part of British folklore. a shorthand for bureaucratic confusion and the strange feeling of being cheated by time. And yet, the adoption of the Gregorian calendar did not bring an immediate end to the confusion. The colonies, scattered across oceans, had to follow suit. Ships crossing the Atlantic often found that they left port on one date and arrived on another entirely. Clerks and priests alike scribbled corrections in their records. Even as late as the 19th century, Russia remained on the Julian system. It took the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, a new political dawn, to bring them into the modern fold. When the decree came, they too erased 13 days from their lives. Wednesday, January 31st, 1918, was followed by Thursday, February 14. Time, it seemed, could be edited by decree. But for all its complications, the Gregorian calendar was remarkably stable. Its error was now so small, just one day every 3,000 years, that it was effectively invisible in human lifetimes. The world had, at last, found a timekeeping system that worked. And yet something quiet, almost invisible, remained unresolved. Even as governments aligned their clocks and calendars, the people themselves, farmers, astronomers, priests, and poets, continued to experience time differently. The rhythms of the earth and the heavens did not always match the paper grids of bureaucrats. The calendar was fixed. But was time? By the time the 19th century opened, the Gregorian calendar had conquered most of the Western world. But as the days settled neatly into their new order, the human relationship with time began to change in a deeper way. The calendar, once a sacred guide tied to the sun and moon, was now a bureaucratic instrument, a grid printed on paper, useful for bookkeeping and timetables. It no longer belonged to the priests or the heavens, but to governments, merchants, and clerks. In the quiet offices of empires, the counting of days became a matter of administration. Colonies were organized by calendars, contracts, taxes, and harvest reports all required precise dates. Time had become a commodity of empire, measured, recorded, and exported. In London, the expansion of trade demanded precision. Ships leaving the docks at Deptford or Portsmouth depended on accurate tides, and on the growing network of marine chronometers that kept them aligned with Greenwich Mean Time. By the 1850s, the Greenwich Observatory was no longer just a scientific site, it had become the beating heart of global time. Across the empire, from Bombay to Barbados, time zones were slowly standardized around this invisible meridian, Yogri's longitude, running through a quiet suburb of London where astronomers worked in silence. The calendar had once divided Europe. Now clocks would unite, or perhaps rule, the world. But the struggle was not entirely over. In the East, older systems lingered. The Ottoman Empire used both the Islamic lunar calendar and the Julian for civil affairs. In China, dynastic calendars changed with each emperor, their years named not by numbers but by reigns. Japan used a similar system until 1873, when it too adopted the Gregorian model as part of its modernization under the Meiji Restoration. The change was practical but disorienting. Farmers and monks who had long followed the rhythms of lunar festivals now found their holy days displaced by foreign calculations. For them, time itself had been colonized, reordered by decree, stripped of local meaning, and turned into something uniform and mechanical. And yet, that uniformity was also powerful. It made global trade, diplomacy, and communication possible. Letters between continents, telegraphs across oceans, railway timetables from one coast to another, all of it required shared reckoning. The calendar, simple and silent, became the foundation of global civilization. The birth of the bureaucratic year. By the late 1800s, the calendar was no longer a question of theology but of governance. Civil service offices ran on fiscal years, schools measured terms and holidays, factories divided shifts by hours, railways by minutes. Time was no longer celestial, it was industrial. In England, clerks filled ledgers under gaslight, recording wages, shipments, and balances by the neat columns of printed dates. Each day, identical in form, became a unit of productivity. The same was true in Paris, Berlin, Boston, and Tokyo. The rhythm of the world had changed. Once, time had flowed with the seasons. Now it ticked in intervals of human design. It was not the first attempt to reorder the calendar for ideological purposes. After the French Revolution, the new republic tried to abolish the Gregorian system altogether. In 1793, France introduced the French Republican calendar, designed to erase Christian influence from the reckoning of time. The year was divided into 12 months of 30 days, with 5 or 6 festival days at the end. Each month contained 3 10-day weeks, decades, replacing the 7-day rhythm of the Sabbath. Even the months were renamed: Vendémiaire as a vintage, Brumaire as Fogue, Frimaire frost, and so on. Poetic reflections of the natural world rather than saints or emperors. Days were named after plants, tools, and animals. The day of the turnip, the day of the sheep, the day of the plough. It was beautiful in a strange way, a quiet rebellion against centuries of ecclesiastical control. But it was also exhausting. 10-day weeks meant fewer rest days, and farmers still relied on traditional seasons. The system, elegant on paper, failed in practice. By 1806, under Napoleon, France quietly returned to the Gregorian calendar time, once again submitted to the old order. A global